Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it. So the book is over there, in case you're wondering, as are past books, by the way. I was here 3 years ago in 1 month in this very same room talking about the first book, Choices, and it's just, I really appreciate the library hosting again. Thank you very much. Just a little bit about me. I am Paul Schatzberger. I am in the School of Education and have been at Southern Wesleyan almost 13 years now. And this is actually my last year. I'm actually retiring. I have just in the last 4 years started to write books. It's something brand new for me. I have been writing journal articles for 30 years and more technical kinds of things. But yeah, there was just something that kind of came up in me. I suppose it was God. And I had been keeping a folder of book ideas for years, and I just didn't even know what to do with it. And one day it was like, well, you know what? I've probably got enough ideas to make a book out of this. And that was Choices. And then another one, like very soon after, which was Moments That Matter. And now this one. And someone has said that you can't tell someone else's story until you can learn to tell your own. And I think that is what God has been leading me through, is to try to first tell my story, because I do want to tell other stories. I want to tell fiction stories, and I want to tell nonfiction stories, but like other people and not me. So I'm just kind of figuring all this stuff out. So this book in particular is, as it says, a love letter to 20-somethings everywhere. I have been teaching 20-somethings for, I guess like 30 years, and then high school before that. And so the rising generation has always been on my heart. And the thing that I think is maybe a little bit different, perhaps, from some professors who spend a lot of time in classes with students, is that I have a number of friends who are also 20-somethings postgraduate, and especially our church has had historically many. And so I've just been able to see the issues, the problems, the challenges up close, and have been a little bit concerned because, you hear this expression, I can't adult. There's an amazing number of books, podcasts that refer to this inability to adult. And so the byline, the subtitle on the book is, Yes, You Can Adult. And so this book actually started off as another book, The Day I Grew Up. And it was just supposed to be stories about me kind of, having these moments where I come on, some situation in my life, and I feel like, I kind of matured out of that, whether it's spiritually or otherwise. And last spring, I was in a writer's conference and had an editor take a look at the book, and she was like, well, this is, I think this is good, but maybe instead of talking for or about 20-somethings, why don't you talk to 20-somethings? Why don't you write to them? And so that changed the entire book, and all the language and everything else like that. But that was different for me. I'd never done that before. And then a little bit later, I was, just trying to kind of decide for myself, well, what is the thread here? If I'm trying to provide hope for 20-somethings to adult, then what is that hope? I mean, it's not my stories. That's not somebody's hope, or dream or something like that. And I realized, just as I reviewed my life, that it's really God's promises. That's really what has been the foundation for me and the anchor for me when things are really bad, or when things are just kind of off in the distance, and I don't think I'm ever actually going to get there. It's really God's promises, and that might be Scripture. It might be something that someone has just said to me. It might be something that I feel like God has spoken to me personally, whatever it might be. And all of those possibilities are in the book. But I realize that this is perhaps something that's missing for this rising generation. And so I also realize that in dealing with, pretty much everybody at my church, that there is kind of there's not the familiarity with the Bible that there used to be. How about that? And so if the Bible contains the promises of God, then it's going to be hard to access those promises if we're not, spending a fair amount of time with the Bible, but also know how to get around and, navigate and that sort of thing. So all of that was a concern of mine. And so what you'll see is not only my stories, but then also referring to Scripture and where does that hope come from. And the last chapter in the book is actually on just hearing the voice of God, hearing and responding to the voice of God, which I think is terribly important, which I think is maybe something that's, not fully understood. So what I do is actually I take some material from another book that talks about the Annunciation to Mary, and I compare it with the announcement to Zechariah about John the Baptist, and say, here's an example, Mary, of things going really well and responding well to God and glorifying God. Here's an example of maybe it could have been done better with Zechariah. They start off in much the same way, but then he begins to kind of question God and wants proof, even as an angel is talking to him, which I don't completely understand. And so he winds up being unable to speak until John the Baptist is born. And it's only then that God gets the glory. Whereas with Mary, it was like instantaneous, And so I just try to, tease that out just a little bit and say kind of what were they doing? What should they have been doing? That kind of thing. So I do try to identify with what people have called liminal spaces and the messiness of life and the decisions that, are out there for us, but we don't know exactly what's going to produce the best result. And what do you do in between when you're not exactly sure that what you've decided is the right thing to do? I've been a missionary to Ukraine. When we were called as missionaries, we were not professional missionaries. We didn't even have language study before we went. And we were kind of looking at each other the first 3 months, my wife and I and my son, going, what have we done? Taking turns, each of us, almost every night, crying. And the other two would say, it's okay, we'll get through this. And then we just take turns, So there's this liminal space, and you've made a big decision, and you feel like this is a faith-filled decision, this is obedience, but this hurts and it's hard, and now what should I do in the meantime until there's kind of this confirmation of it? So I talk about those things as well. I tackle some subjects that are difficult, I think, for some people, like, for instance, miracles and the need for emotional healing. But it's part of my reality, and so I feel, I'm not going to hold anything back, and I'm going to try to be as authentic as I can be about those things, but just also saying, basically, oh, me of little faith. I am not a faith-filled person, and so when I say that I was involved in these kinds of things, what I mean is I was in the right place for God to do these things. That's basically what I mean. And so there's another aspect of the book, and that is, how do you put yourself in the right place? And that's basically saying yes to God. That's the short answer. So I hope this will be good for 20-somethings, but I also hope it'll be maybe a good gift for parents, for grandparents, for graduations, things like that. It's because when we graduate, it doesn't matter where we graduate from. It's high school, or if it's undergrad, or if it's graduate, or if it's a doctorate, you still are like, now what? Now what am I supposed to be doing? So it is nice to have some kind of reference, the Bible being the best one. So I don't know what you want to hear about this. I will talk about future projects in just a moment, but do you have any questions, things that have occurred to you while I've been talking?
I think this is really good. I think these are questions that the students I work with have, and I like the size of this for them.
Yes. Okay.
Because Dallas Willard has a book about sort of hearing the voice of God, and it's maybe 4 or 5 times.
Yes.
Big.
Yes.
And so I really appreciate that and look forward to looking through it.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, I think a lot of, maybe all of us struggling with the fact that adulting today requires me to create a login and a password for about 100 different things.
Yeah.
And we're going to get to the point that I think going to the ER, you're going to have to create a login and a password and set up an appointment first.
Mm-hmm.
And that, life just seems, I think a lot of adults' life is full of so much red tape and bureaucratic and logistical details. And I don't really want to read a book about that.
I don't either. Yeah.
So why write one? But I'm wondering, just again, I think that's some of the stuff that's very overwhelming.
Yeah.
For a lot of young people, and how might your book sort of just help with what people think of as the responsibilities of adulting? Right.
Yeah. So the question is, if anyone can't hear it, what about the responsibilities of adulting? Because it does, what I talk about at the beginning, the very first chapter is, and actually the introduction is, right now, adulting feels not only like a burden, but it feels like it's not worth it, because of economic conditions, because of all sorts of conditions that didn't literally exist when I was doing this thing, in the 70s. I was of a mind, and my generation was of a mind, and I believe it was true. If you, put your mind to it and you get that, college degree, you can be better off than your parents. And that is simply not the case now. And it's not that it can't be, but for most people, for a lot of people, just consider the crushing debt coming out of college, And so if you don't get, I don't know what, a highfalutin business job, but instead you wind up being a teacher, that's some rough going there, So the question is, where does hope come from? And my thing is, you can be worldly wise and you can be very successful in this world and really still not understand what it takes to adult spiritually. You can be actually a person who is not of wealth and kind of subsisting, and you can have a very satisfactory life because you have the peace that this other person doesn't have. And so I am not, the book is not about like writing checks or, getting an ATM card or something like that. The book is, how do you become a stable person, and how do you stay stable in the midst of all of this craziness that's going on right now? And I feel, especially right now, for late millennial, early Gen Z, who have been through what we've been through in the last 20 years. It is phenomenal to me we could point to certain things for particular generations. Like for instance, the Depression, World War II for my parents, or Vietnam for my generation, for Gen X, Iran, Iraq, we could point to those things and we could say, specifically, this was really bad, but it just seems like it's just bad, starting with about 9/11. It's just kind of been very, very difficult, and everything's connected, like we're in the midst of this Russia thing right now, and somebody was talking about, well, get ready for the prices to go up at the pump because of what's happening in Ukraine. That's the kind of world that we live in. So if that's reality, and if people have had to deal with school shootings and terrorist attacks and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and it doesn't look like it's going to let up, and then, oh, by the way, a pandemic, then what kind of person do we need to be in the midst of that? If that's really not going to go away, and I'm not sure it is anytime real soon, how can we avoid just succumbing and just saying, woe is me, and that's the end of it, So again, maybe someday I'll write a book, starting a bank account or something like that. But I feel like the problems are so deep right now, and the uncertainties are so deep that I just feel like where we need to start is hope, and then we'll just kind of build from there, and take some workshops and classes and that sort of thing. But thanks, I appreciate that, because it's huge.
Yeah, I like how you said that, becoming and remaining a stable person.
Yeah, right. And that was just kind of assumed of my generation. And let me be clear, by the way, this rising generation, I think they will be just fine. I think we will be just fine. But so I'm less concerned with the outcome than I am with the process. For myself, the boomer generation, there were a lot of doubts when we came along. I mean, especially with my parents' generation. They were like, these kids are out of control, and we're going off to Woodstock and we're just doing, whatever, not caring about our future or anything else like that. And yet, somehow now, we are in control of the world. We run the world, literally. All the presidents and the senators and the congressmen, that stuff happens. If you stick around long enough, you will wind up in charge. That's just the rule, okay? That's a longevity thing. But what kind of condition are you going to be in when you get to that point? And what we've seen lately is that there are some character issues with leaders. And so, yes, they're in charge, but where is their hope? It's not the Bible and it's not God. And it's really causing some problems. And so let's address that first. And then, everybody can go be in charge later, So it's kind of, it's like that, it's like the gospel. It's kind of upside down everything, and you start with the last first and the first last, Other comments, questions? I don't know if I really should read you any of this, but there's a story that I include in a chapter called Need for Healing, which is a lot about a very, very difficult time for me. This was in the 1990s, and my dad had died, and and I had a young family and a brand new career, and it was, I just felt completely adrift, just adrift, you know. And so I wrote about that. So I'll just read that really quick to you. A difficult thing about losing someone so influential in our lives is that we don't just lose them once. That's how the world imagines it, but it's not true. The world sees our loss taking place on a single day, and the funeral and the grief taking place on another day. But we lose these significant people over and over, day after day, sometimes for years. In one way, this is honoring to the person who died. We don't want them to be quickly forgotten. So at least initially the grief can feel appropriate and necessary. There's some undefinable crossroad, however, where we begin to drown in loss and sadness, and depression consumes our lives. Eventually, a kind of rigor mortis sets in, and we realize that we have also died. 1 Samuel 16:1 presents us with a similar situation. Saul had been anointed as king by Samuel, the prophet. After a hopeful beginning, Saul relies less on God and more on his own judgment, which was flawed. Ultimately, he disobeyed a direct command from God. Though Saul had been a frustration for Samuel, he continued to be an advocate of Saul's before God. Finally, God had had enough. So we come to 1 Samuel 16:1, the intersection of three lives. Now the Lord said to Samuel, "You have mourned long enough for Saul. I have rejected him as king of Israel, so fill your flask with olive oil and go to Bethlehem. Find a man named Jesse who lives there, for I have selected one of his sons to be my king." As harsh as it seems, God had to shake Samuel and tell him to get over Saul and get on with his mission, which was to anoint the new king of Israel, David. Sometimes when we're mired in grief and self-pity, God graciously gives us a promise that he has more for us to do, just as he did for Samuel. I couldn't have imagined the creative way God would make that promise to me. And then I just go on to talk about this thing. But the important thing is that God didn't instantly change everything. What he did was he gave me the promise, and he said, it's going to be okay. And then years later, it was okay. But there was this process that I had to go through, which was quite extensive, and that we all have to go through, I think. So at any rate, that's the idea. Just if you're interested, probably not, but that's okay. I'm working on a fiction piece right now, a novella called A Thief in the Night, and telling other people's stories that don't actually exist. So that's kind of fun. And that actually includes that emotional and spiritual healing as well in that story. And then I've kind of teamed up with some guys who are interested in a lot of different things, and we're working on this nonfiction called Lost Friendship and Creativity, about the lives of two pairs of creatives, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, and John Lennon and Paul McCartney. And we are kind of investigating, because each one lost their mother in pre-adolescence or adolescence very early, and yet wound up being this amazingly successful creative, but had this person that he was joined to, and kind of was able to get through all of the really hard stuff. So yeah, I'm doing that with a couple other guys, and that's a whole lot of fun. So anyway, the authoring continues. Any other comments, questions before we quit? All right. Don't sneak up on me like that. All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone who's tuned in. Buy the book. It's on Amazon. It's also on Kindle, if you like Kindle. And it's $14, which is a steal, a bargain at the price.
Thanks for listening to Moments That Matter, a podcast that looks at the moments in our lives that come along from time to time that have consequences long after the moment, especially those moments that have to do with the choice of vocation. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation, Parker Palmer speaks of a clearness committee in the Quaker tradition, wherein a group of older, wiser people ask questions of someone considering a life choice as a way of clarifying the next step. We may not meet with a committee about these big decisions, but we all have these critical junctures in our lives, which we can think of as clearness committee moments. We need to pay attention to these moments because they are profound and potentially life-altering. We'll relay stories from our lives and interview others about theirs, especially noting the clearness committee moments, those we choose to recognize and those that were sadly ignored, those decisions that were made with God in mind and those that were not. Our hope is that these podcasts will cause you to think of the same kind of moments in your life with new clarity.